The knock came hard. Not polite, not careful. A blunt odor against the wood that rattled the thin glass panel beside the door. Daniel Carter froze with the coffee mug halfway to his mouth. It was just past 9 in the evening. The kind of quiet Ohio night where sound traveled too far. No neighbors, no traffic, no reason for anyone to be standing on his porch knocking like they were angry at the door itself. The second knock was louder. Daniel set the mug down slowly. His chest tightened not with fear, but with something heavier. The kind of unease you get when your body recognizes trouble before your mind catches up. He walked to the door and glanced through the side window. A woman stood there, rigid shoulders squared against the cold. A dark sedan idled at the curb with its headlights still on, washing the lawn in white glare. Her coat was soaked at the hem. Rain clung to her hair. She was staring straight ahead, not at the doorbell, not at the porch light, at the house itself, like it had betrayed her. Daniel opened the door. For a fraction of a second, neither of them spoke. Margaret Wilson did not look like a former chief executive standing on a subordinate's doorstep. She looked like someone who had driven too fast, stopped too suddenly, and hadn't decided yet whether to turn around. "I need to come in," she said. No greeting, no apology. Her voice was calm, but it carried an edge that scraped. Daniel didn't move. He was still wearing an old sweatshirt and work pants. His living room light spilled out behind him soft and yellow, revealing just enough to make the moment awkward. Two people from different worlds colliding at the threshold. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "I know." Another beat of silence. Rain ticked against the porch railing. The engine outside hummed impatient. Margaret finally looked at him. Really looked. Her eyes were sharp alert and carrying something that hadn't been there in the boardroom. Fear. Not the kind that shakes your hands, the kind that makes you decisive. "Daniel," she said, "if I walk away tonight, there are things that won't survive it. I need 5 minutes." He stepped aside. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded louder than the knock had. The house smelled like coffee and old wood. A small place. Clean, but unfinished. Like someone had paused mid-life and never pressed play again. Margaret took off her coat without being asked and draped it over the back of a chair. Water pooled on the floor. She didn't notice. She was already scanning the room, her eyes moving with the same precision she used in factories and crisis meetings. Daniel stayed near the door. "You didn't even call," he said. She nodded once. "If I had, you wouldn't have answered." "That's not true." "It is," she said. Not unkindly, just factual. The air between them felt tight, charged. This wasn't a reunion. It was a confrontation wearing polite clothes. "Do you know what happened today?" Margaret asked. Daniel frowned. "I left the company 3 days ago. I know exactly when you left." Her jaw tightened. The muscle there jumped once. Daniel noticed. He always noticed small things. It was why people underestimated him. They mistook quiet for absence. "The board convened an emergency session this afternoon," she continued. "No agenda, no warning. That sounds like their style. They blamed you." The words landed heavy. Not explosive. Worse. Dense. Daniel let out a short breath. "For what?" "For everything," Margaret said. "Delayed shipments. Integration failures. A safety review that somehow missed a compliance flag. They said the systems you designed were too centralized, too dependent on one person." She paused, watched his face. "They said you left because you knew the collapse was coming." Daniel laughed once, a dry sound that surprised even him. "That's convenient. They voted," she said. Another step closer, not aggressive, intentional. "They voted to initiate a forensic audit. Of your department, of your decisions, of you." The room went very still. Daniel felt heat rise behind his eyes. Not panic. Anger. Controlled old anger. The kind that had kept him alive in meetings where younger men talked over him and smiled like they'd won. "They're looking for a scapegoat," he said. "Yes. And you let them." "No," Margaret said sharply, her voice cut. For the first time since she arrived, emotion leaked through. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. "I shut it down." Daniel looked at her then. Really looked. "You don't shut down a board audit," he said. "Not without consequences." Her mouth tightened. "I know." Silence again. Longer this time. Outside, the rain eased into a steady drizzle. Inside, the clock on the wall ticked loud enough to be annoying. "What aren't you telling me?" Daniel asked. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She walked to the window and looked out at the street. At her car. At the light still burning like an open wound. "They didn't just want an audit," she said. "They wanted leverage. Against you. Against me." Daniel's pulse slowed. This was the part where instincts mattered. "You're stepping down," he said. She turned. "They gave me a choice." He felt it then. The shift. The realization clicking into place with sick precision. "They wanted me gone quietly," she continued. "Or they'd make sure your name was tied to failures you didn't cause." Daniel swallowed. "That's extortion. That's governance," Margaret replied. "On paper." She took a breath. The first deep one since she arrived. "I resigned this afternoon." The words didn't explode. They sank. Daniel stared at her. 60 years old. Built a company from scrap and stubbornness. Forced out by men who'd never set foot on a factory floor. "You came here to tell me that he asked." "No," she said. "I came here because they're not done. They think you're alone. That you'll keep your head down. That you'll protect the company instead of yourself." Her eyes locked onto his. "They're wrong." Daniel felt something stir in his chest. Not hope. Resolve. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Margaret stepped closer. Close enough now that he could see the lines at the corners of her eyes. The exhaustion she never showed in public. "I want you to stop being small," she said. "They underestimated you. They always have. They think you were just an operations man who burned out and walked away." She leaned in, her voice low. "They don't know who actually built the backbone of that company. They don't know what you still control." Daniel's jaw clenched. "That's not power," he said. "That's liability." "It's both," Margaret said. "And right now, it's the only thing standing between the truth and a very convenient lie." Another knock sounded. Sharp. From inside Daniel's chest this time. "Margaret," he said quietly, "you accepted my resignation." "I did." She didn't look away. "But I never accepted losing you," she said. "Not to them. Not to this." The room seemed to narrow. The air thickened. Something irreversible had just been spoken. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Then you shouldn't have come alone," he said. For the first time, Margaret smiled. Not the polished smile from shareholder meetings. Something harder. Something relieved. "I didn't," she said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thin folder, set it on the table. The cover bore a seal Daniel recognized instantly. His breath caught. Because some doors once knocked on were never meant to stay closed. Daniel did not touch the folder. He stared at it the way you look at a loaded weapon you never planned to own. Margaret waited. She had learned long ago that silence used correctly made people reveal themselves faster than pressure ever could. "Say it," Daniel finally said. She tilted her head. "Say what?" "Say why. That seal is on my table," he replied. His voice was even, but his hands had curled into fists at his sides. And say it like you're talking to someone who already knows he's been underestimated. Margaret exhaled through her nose, slow and controlled. You remember the redundancy protocol you designed after the Toledo incident? Daniel's eyes flicked to the folder. That was internal, he said. And buried. It was buried because you insisted, she said. You told me systems fail, people lie, and paper trails get rewritten. You told me the company needed a spine it could not break. He closed his eyes for half a second. When he opened them, something colder had replaced the fatigue. You activated it, he said. Yes. A beat. Without board approval. Yes. Another beat. Longer. That protocol gives access to operational records the board doesn't even know exist, Daniel said. Vendor communications, safety overrides, internal memos, everything. Margaret nodded, including the emails they deleted last quarter. Daniel let out a breath that sounded like a laugh, but carried no humor. They were sloppy, he said. They were arrogant, Margaret corrected. They assumed you were gone, and I was cornered. The rain picked up again outside, harder now, drumming against the windows with renewed insistence. The sound filled the room, made it feel smaller, closer. Daniel finally reached for the folder. His fingers brushed the seal. He did not open it yet. They think I walked away, he said. They think I'm licking my wounds. They think you're tired, Margaret replied. They think you'll protect the company out of loyalty. Daniel looked at her sharply. Wouldn't you? She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was quieter. I protected the company for 30 years. Tonight, I'm protecting the truth. He studied her face. The lines were deeper than he remembered. Not from age, from restraint. You didn't come here just to warn me, he said. No, she agreed. I came because they're moving faster than I expected. A knock echoed suddenly through the house. Not the door this time. The window. Daniel turned, heart spiking. A shadow passed across the glass. Another knock, firmer, more deliberate. Margaret's posture changed instantly. Spine straight, shoulders back. The woman who had walked into hostile boardrooms without blinking was back. Do you have cameras? She asked. Daniel nodded once. Front and back. Check the back, she said. Now. He moved quickly, pulling up the feed on his phone. The image sharpened. The glow of infrared. A man stood near the fence line, phone pressed to his ear, pacing like he owned the darkness. Daniel's jaw tightened. That's Mark Halstead. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Board counsel. He followed you? Daniel said. Yes, she replied. Or rather, he followed the protocol activation. The knock came again, this time at the front door. Polite. Controlled. The kind of knock meant to intimidate without alarming the neighbors. Daniel felt the old instinct kick in, the one that had kept him alive through audits and accusations and quiet threats dressed up as meetings. I'm not opening that, he said. You don't have to, Margaret replied. He's not here to arrest you. Daniel glanced at her. Not yet. She met his gaze. He's here to scare you. The knock came a third time. Firmer now. Daniel Carter, a voice called through the door. Smooth, legal, smiling without warmth. I know you're home. Daniel moved to the window, staying out of sight. Margaret remained where she was visible through the glass if anyone looked closely. Mark doesn't know I'm here, she said quietly. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You sure? He thinks I went home, she replied. He thinks I'm grieving. The voice outside continued. This doesn't have to be complicated, Halstead said. We just need to ask a few questions. Daniel leaned closer to Margaret. You said they were sloppy. They were, she said. They didn't count on you being calm. Another knock. Harder now. Daniel felt his pulse steady. This was familiar ground. Pressure. Assumptions, men who mistook silence for weakness. He reached for the folder and opened it. Inside were printed emails, time-stamped, highlighted, names he recognized immediately, conversations about bypassing safety reviews to meet quarterly targets, conversations that ended with one line repeated like a prayer. Daniel Carter will handle it. He felt heat flare behind his eyes. Not surprise, recognition. They set me up, he said softly. Margaret nodded. They used your reputation as cover. The knock turned into pounding. Open the door! Halstead snapped, irritation breaking through his polish. Or we'll assume non-cooperation. Daniel closed the folder and looked at Margaret. You resigned today, he said. They think you're out. Yes. And I quit, he continued, which means I don't answer to them anymore. Correct. He smiled then, not wide, not kind, calculated. That protocol, he said. It doesn't just store records. Margaret's eyes flickered. No, she said. It mirrors them. In 3 locations, Daniel added, one of them outside the company. Margaret inhaled slowly. You never told me where. I didn't tell anyone, he replied. The pounding stopped. Silence fell heavy on the porch. Daniel glanced at the camera feed. Halstead stood very still now, phone lowered, listening. Waiting. You have leverage, Margaret said. Enough to expose them. Daniel shook his head. Exposure isn't the goal. Her eyes narrowed. Then what is... He met her gaze. The man who had been overlooked in meetings, who had let others take credit for his work, who had stayed late without complaint, was gone. Control, he said. They tried to erase me. I want them to understand what that costs. The doorbell rang. Once. Sharp. Margaret's phone vibrated in her pocket. She glanced at it and let out a quiet breath. Too late, she said. What Daniel asked. She turned the screen toward him. A news alert flashed across it. Breaking. Apex Manufacturing faces internal leadership crisis as CEO resigns amid allegations of governance misconduct. Daniel's eyebrows rose. That was fast. I sent the file to a journalist I trust, Margaret said. Not everything, just enough. The doorbell rang again. Halstead's voice cut through the night. This is your last chance to cooperate. Daniel straightened, walked to the door, placed his hand on the knob. Margaret watched him, her expression unreadable. You don't owe me this, she said quietly. Daniel paused. I know. He opened the door. Halstead blinked clearly, not expecting him to be so calm. His eyes flicked past Daniel's shoulder, scanning the room. Calculating, Mr. Carter, he said smoothly. We'd like to discuss some irregularities. Daniel smiled. Of course, he said. But not tonight. Halstead stiffened. This isn't optional. Daniel leaned in just enough for his words to land. It is when you're standing on my porch, he said, and when the story you're trying to tell just broke nationally. Halstead's phone buzzed. He glanced down, his face drained of color. Daniel stepped back and gestured to the street. I suggest you go, he said. Before you're asked questions you can't answer. Halstead hesitated, pride warring with instinct. Margaret stepped into view behind Daniel. Halstead's eyes widened. You, he said. You said you were. I said I was done protecting you, Margaret replied. Halstead swallowed, took a step back. The rain soaked his shoes as he retreated down the steps. Daniel closed the door gently. Inside the house felt different now, charged, awake. Margaret looked at him, something like admiration flickering across her face. This isn't over, she said. Daniel nodded. No, he agreed. It's just begun. Outside, the sedan finally pulled away, its headlights disappearing into the wet Ohio night. The silence after the door closed did not feel like relief. It felt like the pause before something heavier landed. Daniel leaned back against the door for a moment, eyes shut, listening to his own breathing slow. The house seemed to hold its breath with him. The clock kept ticking. The rain kept tapping. Everything else had shifted. Margaret was the first to move. She crossed the room, picked up the folder, and slid it farther from the edge of the table, as if stabilizing it might stabilize the night. "They'll regroup," she said. "Halstead never shows up alone unless he already has a plan." Daniel nodded. He pushed away from the door and rolled his shoulders, once loosening tension that had been building for months. "They already regrouped," he said. "That audit wasn't about truth. It was about control." Margaret studied him. "You sound like someone who's already decided what comes next." "I have," Daniel replied. He walked to the kitchen counter and poured water into a glass hand steady. "The only reason they move this fast is because they're afraid of timing. Not evidence. Timing." She raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Daniel took a sip. "The redundancy system mirrors data with a delay. 48 hours. Enough time to detect tampering. Enough time to document intent." Margaret's gaze sharpened. And I got an alert this morning," he said. "Before you resigned. Before Halstead showed up." She went still. "What kind of alert?" Daniel met her eyes. "An override attempt. Unauthorized. High level." The words landed like a weight. "They tried to rewrite the logs," Margaret said quietly. "Yes," Daniel replied. "Which means they knew something was coming." Margaret's jaw set. They wouldn't risk that unless they already knew the audit wouldn't hold, Daniel finished. Unless they were planning to burn the house and blame the wiring. Margaret exhaled slowly. "They were going to make you the failure." "They already tried," he said. "They just miscalculated how much of the foundation ran through me." She looked at the folder again. "You could walk away," she said. "You've done enough. More than enough." Daniel didn't answer right away. He stared at the water in his glass, the faint ripple from his pulse still traveling through it. "I spent 30 years building systems that kept other people safe," he said finally. "Workers, operators, families who never knew my name. I let the board take credit because I believed the work mattered more than recognition." Margaret listened, her face unreadable. "I walked away because I thought the cost was my health," Daniel continued. "But tonight made something very clear." He set the glass down. "They're willing to let people get hurt to protect their margins." Margaret's eyes darkened. "You're certain?" "I wouldn't be standing here if I wasn't." Another silence. This one heavier, more deliberate. "What do you want from me?" Margaret asked. Daniel turned to face her fully. "I want you to stop thinking like a former CEO." Her lips twitched. "That might be harder than it sounds." "I want you to think like the woman who built Apex when no one was watching," he said. "Before the board, before the press, before the politics." Margaret held his gaze. For a moment, the years fell away. He saw her as she must have been then. Focused. Relentless. Uncompromising. "Say it," she said. "I'm going to trigger the external mirror," Daniel said. "Not all of it. Just enough to expose the pattern. Safety violations. Timeline manipulation. Internal pressure to suppress reports." Margaret's breath caught. "That would force regulatory oversight." "Yes." "And destroy the board's narrative," she added. "Yes. And take the company public in a way none of them can control." Daniel nodded. "Which is why they'll try to stop it." Margaret paced, once, then stopped. "If you do this," she said, "they'll come for you personally. Lawsuits, smears." They'll say you're disgruntled, unstable. He smiled faintly. They already are. She stopped in front of him, close enough now that he could see the exhaustion etched deep beneath her composure. You don't owe me this, she repeated. Or the company. Daniel met her eyes. I owe myself. The words hung between them steady and unmovable. Margaret straightened. Then we need to be precise. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. I resigned publicly, but legally, I'm still a shareholder. Minority but vocal. That gives me standing. Daniel nodded. And I have documentation that predates the last 3 boards. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen. I can call the journalist again, expand the scope, shift the framing from leadership crisis to safety accountability. Daniel watched her, the old respect resurfacing in a new form. This wasn't authority. This was alignment. Her phone buzzed. She frowned at the screen. Who is it? Daniel asked. She hesitated. My daughter. He tilted his head. At this hour, Margaret answered, her voice softening immediately. Claire. Daniel turned away, giving her privacy, but he could hear the tension bleed into her posture. Yes, I know I'm fine. No, I'm not alone. A pause. Longer this time. Yes, Margaret said quietly. I'm with him. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Margaret closed her eyes for a brief second. I know. I will. She hung up and slipped the phone back into her pocket. She's worried, Daniel said. She's angry, Margaret replied. She thinks I spent my life choosing the company over everything else. Daniel didn't respond. He knew that accusation well. Different words, same wound. She asked me if I was finally choosing myself, Margaret continued. I didn't have an answer. Daniel looked at her, then really looked. You're here, he said. That's an answer. A small smile touched her lips, then faded. It may cost me her trust. Or it may show her what courage actually looks like, he replied. The rain outside softened into a mist. The house seemed warmer now, like it had accepted what was coming. Daniel walked back to the table and opened his laptop. The screen glowed to life, illuminating his face with cold light. You still have access? Margaret asked. I never lost it, Daniel said. I just stopped using it. He typed quickly, fingers moving with practiced certainty. Lines of data filled the screen. Logs, timestamps, cross-referenced entries that told a story no press release ever could. Margaret leaned over his shoulder. There, she said, pointing. That override. Daniel nodded. That's the one. Another alert flashed. Margaret stiffened. They're trying again. Daniel's mouth set into a hard line. They won't succeed. He pressed a key. The screen changed. External mirror engaged, the system read. Synchronization in progress. Margaret's breath left her in a slow exhale. Once this finishes, there's no pulling it back. Daniel didn't look away from the screen. Good. The clock ticked. Each second felt deliberate now. Earned. Margaret straightened her shoulders, settling into a familiar posture. Not defensive. Ready. Whatever happens next, she said, I'm glad I came. Daniel glanced at her. You didn't come for me. She met his gaze. I came because I finally stopped pretending I could separate what mattered. The progress bar inched forward. Outside, somewhere down the street, a car engine started. Then another. Daniel's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He ignored it. The system chimed softly. Complete. Daniel closed the laptop. Somewhere far beyond, the quiet Ohio street systems would begin to shake. Narratives would fracture. Men who thought they were untouchable would start making calls they could not control. Margaret stood beside him, steady and silent. "What now?" she asked. Daniel looked at the door, then at the window, then back at her. "Now," he said, "we let the truth do its work." And for the first time all night, the silence that followed felt earned. Morning did not arrive gently. It came with the buzz of Daniel's phone vibrating itself off the kitchen counter and the low hum of a news helicopter somewhere above the neighborhood. He opened his eyes, already awake, mind sharp, body heavy. He hadn't slept. Neither had Margaret. She stood at the window now, coffee untouched in her hands, watching the sky lighten from black to steel gray. "They found it," she said without turning. Daniel didn't ask who. He checked his phone. Missed calls, stacked one after another. Unknown numbers, local, out of state. One from a Washington area code that made his jaw tighten. A headline notification slid across the screen. "Federal safety regulators open inquiry into Apex Manufacturing after leaked records reveal internal overrides." Daniel exhaled slowly. That was fast. "It always is when someone thinks they're about to lose control," Margaret replied. Her voice was steady, but the muscles in her neck were tight. She hadn't slept either. Not from fear, from calculation. Another notification followed, then another. Whistleblower documents suggest board-level awareness of safety risks. Daniel locked the phone and set it face down. "They'll say I manipulated the data. They'll say you're angry," Margaret said. "They'll say you're unstable. They'll say you're trying to burn the place down because you couldn't keep up." He nodded. "They always do." She finally turned from the window and looked at him. Really looked. The quiet man who had spent decades making sure other people didn't get hurt. The man whose name never appeared in press releases. "You're calm," she said. "I'm done being afraid," Daniel replied. "There's a difference." A knock sounded at the door. Not the aggressive pounding from the night before. Controlled. Official. Margaret's shoulders squared. "They're early." Daniel glanced at the clock. 6:30 in the morning. "I'll handle it," he said. She hesitated. "They won't play fair. They never do." He opened the door to find two men standing on the porch, both in dark jackets, no visible weapons. Badges flashed quickly like a courtesy. "Daniel Carter," the taller one asked. "That's me. We're with the Occupational Safety and Compliance Division," the man said. "We'd like to ask you some questions." Daniel stepped aside without argument. "Come in." Margaret watched from the kitchen doorway as the men entered, eyes scanning the room with professional curiosity. They noticed the laptop on the table, the coffee cups, the coat draped over the chair. "You live alone?" one of them asked. "Yes." The shorter agent glanced at Margaret. "And you are?" Margaret met his gaze without blinking. "A guest." The taller agent nodded, already forming assumptions. "Mr. Carter, we understand you recently resigned from Apex Manufacturing. That's correct. And shortly after confidential materials were released to the press." Daniel folded his arms. "I didn't release anything." The agent smiled faintly. "We didn't say you did." Margaret watched closely. This was the dance. Questions meant to destabilize. Silence meant to imply guilt. "What we'd like to know," the agent continued, "is whether you had access to internal systems after your resignation." Daniel answered evenly. "Access does not equal action." The agent scribbled something in his notebook. "We'll need to examine your devices." Daniel didn't flinch. "I'll need a warrant." The smile vanished. The man's eyes hardened. "We can make this difficult," he said. Daniel met his gaze. "You already are." Margaret stepped forward then. "Just one step, enough to shift the balance." "You might want to be careful," she said calmly. "About how you proceed." Both agents turned to her. "And you are the taller one?" asked again. Margaret did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Margaret Wilson," she said. Former Chief Executive Officer of Apex Manufacturing, current shareholder, and the person who authorized the release of those materials. Silence fell like a dropped plate. The shorter agent's pen froze mid-scratch. "You authorized—" "Yes," Margaret said, after discovering that the board had knowingly allowed safety overrides that put workers at risk. Overrides Mr. Carter repeatedly warned them about. Daniel felt the shift immediately. Not just in the room, in the story. The taller agent cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we weren't informed." "Of course you weren't," Margaret replied, "because the narrative you were given was incomplete." She walked to the table and picked up the folder Daniel had left there overnight, set it down in front of them, opened it. "These are original records," she said. "Unaltered, time-stamped, cross-verified. You'll also find communications indicating that any attempt to scapegoat Mr. Carter was premeditated." The agents exchanged a look, professional concern creeping in. "You're accusing the board of conspiracy," the taller one said carefully. Margaret nodded once. "Yes." Daniel watched them reassess. This was no longer a tired former employee and a messy resignation. This was governance failure, regulatory exposure, headlines that didn't go away. "We'll take these," the agent said, reaching for the folder. "You'll make copies," Margaret corrected. "The originals stay." Another pause. Outside, a car door slammed. Voices murmured. More people arriving. Daniel felt the house tighten again. Pressure shifting outward now. The agents finally nodded. "We'll be in touch." As they turned to leave, the taller one stopped. "Mr. Carter," he said, "for what it's worth, people don't usually build systems like that unless they're planning for something." Daniel met his eyes. "I was." The door closed behind them. Margaret exhaled slowly and leaned against the counter. For the first time since the night before, her composure cracked. Just a little. "That was sooner than I expected," she said. "They'll circle back," Daniel replied. "With lawyers." Her phone buzzed again. She checked it and let out a short breath. "Board emergency call. They want me on it." Daniel nodded. "They'll try to reframe. They always do." She looked at him, then something unresolved in her expression. "You don't have to stay involved." He shook his head. "I'm already involved." Another vibration. This time Daniel's phone. A name flashed on the screen that made him go still. Claire Wilson. Margaret noticed. Her breath caught. "She's calling you?" "She must have found my number in old files," Daniel said. "Or she's smarter than we give her credit for." Margaret hesitated. "Answer it." "He did," Daniel Clare said without preamble. Her voice was tight, controlled anger. "What did you do?" "I told the truth," he replied. "You dragged my mother into a public mess," she snapped. "Do you know what this is doing to her reputation?" Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "I didn't drag her anywhere." She walked in. A beat. "She's always cleaning up other people's disasters," Claire said, "including yours." Margaret flinched. Daniel opened his eyes. "No," he said gently. She stopped cleaning them up. "That's the difference." Silence on the line. Breathing. "You don't know her like you think you do," Claire said finally. Daniel looked at Margaret standing across the room, exhausted and unyielding. "I know exactly who she is," he replied. The call ended. Margaret turned away, swallowing hard. Daniel didn't move toward her, didn't touch her. This wasn't a moment for comfort. It was a moment for truth. "They'll try to isolate you," he said quietly. "Use family, reputation, fear." She nodded. "They always do." Outside, the helicopter passed again, closer this time. Margaret straightened the weight settling back onto her shoulders. Not as armor, as resolve. Then we don't let them, she said. Daniel looked at the clock, then at the door, then at the woman who had finally chosen to stop being careful. Next, he said they're going to ask who really runs the spine of that company. Margaret met his gaze, understanding dawning. And when they do, she said they're going to learn something they should have asked years ago. The phone buzzed again. This time a news request. Daniel let it ring. Some truths needed time to breathe. The board meeting went live at 8 sharp, and by 8:03 the tone had already shifted. Daniel listened from the kitchen table, laptop open, but camera off, Margaret's voice coming through the speaker with the same controlled precision she used to dismantle hostile earnings calls. The difference now was that she was no longer defending performance. She was interrogating intent. "I'm going to say this once," Margaret said. "If anyone on this call believes the safety overrides were isolated incidents, I invite you to explain why the same directive appears across 3 plants, 2 fiscal years, and multiple chains of command." A pause. Paper shuffling. Someone cleared his throat. "That's a serious accusation," a male voice said. Older, Midwest accent. Daniel recognized him. Frank Lowell, longtime board member, career finance, never set foot on a factory floor. "So are workplace injuries," Margaret replied. "And wrongful death lawsuits." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. The weight of it pressed into his chest, but it wasn't fear. It was recognition. This was the moment systems either corrected or collapsed. Another voice cut in. Female. Tight. "Margaret, you resigned. Your authority here is—" "My authority as a shareholder and fiduciary remains intact," Margaret said. "And my responsibility to the people who built this company does not end because you're uncomfortable." Daniel heard a muted reaction. Someone swore under their breath, not realizing their mic was hot. Margaret continued, calm as steel. "You asked who authorized the overrides. You already know the answer. What you don't know is how long the cover stories were coordinated." Daniel's screen lit up with a new message. Unknown sender. A single line. "You think you're untouchable. You're not." He didn't reply. He never replied to threats. He archived them. On the call, Frank Lowell spoke again. "We need to contain this," he said. "Regulators are involved. Media is circling. This isn't the time for internal blame." Margaret laughed once. Short. Sharp. "This is exactly the time." Daniel leaned back in his chair, letting her voice carry. She was doing what she'd always done best, holding a line when everyone else wanted to soften it. "We can discuss optics later," she went on. "Right now we're discussing accountability, and whether this board intends to cooperate or obstruct." A new voice joined the call. Younger, measured, legal. "Margaret, this is outside counsel," the voice said. "I strongly advise I know what you advise." Margaret cut in. "I also know who signs your checks." Silence. Daniel smiled faintly. Somewhere in the city, lawyers were recalculating their billing hours. The call ended abruptly 10 minutes later. No resolution, no consensus. Just tension hanging like smoke. Margaret muted the speaker and finally let herself sit. She rubbed her temples with 2 fingers, the gesture small but telling. "They'll fracture," Daniel said. "They always do under pressure." She nodded. Already happening. 2 of them reached out privately, asked if there was a way to distance themselves. "Self-preservation," Daniel replied. "Yes," she said, "and fear." His phone buzzed again. This time a name he hadn't seen in years. Tom Alvarez. Daniel hesitated, then answered. "Tom." "You picked a hell of a week to disappear," Tom said. His voice carried the noise of a busy room behind him. "Machinery. People. A plant floor. How are things? Daniel asked. Tom laughed bitterly. You tell me. OSHA's on site. Corporate's sending emails telling us to stay on script. Half my supervisors are scared. The other half are angry. Daniel closed his eyes. Tom had been a line manager when Daniel first started, one of the few who'd listened. Anyone hurt? Daniel asked. Not today, Tom said, but there were close calls last quarter. We flagged them. You know that. I know, Daniel replied. Did anyone tell you to drop it? A pause. Yes, Tom said quietly. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. Who? Tom hesitated. You already know. Daniel exhaled slowly. I'm sorry. No, Tom said. Don't be. You warned us. We just didn't realize who we were up against. Another message appeared on Daniel's screen. This one from a reporter. Then another, and another. Margaret watched him. It's starting. It already started, he replied. It's just louder now. She studied him for a moment. You're not surprised. I've been expecting this since the day I built the mirror, Daniel said. You don't design a system like that unless you believe someone will eventually test it. Her lips pressed together. And did you believe it would come to this? He considered the question. I believed the truth would eventually cost something. A knock sounded at the door. Not official, not aggressive. Careful. Almost hesitant. Daniel stood. Stay here. He opened the door to find Claire Wilson on the porch. She looked tired, not disheveled, controlled like her mother, but her eyes were red, and she was gripping her keys too tightly. We need to talk, she said. Margaret appeared behind him before he could answer. Claire's gaze snapped to her. You couldn't even wait a day, she said. You had to blow everything up. Margaret didn't flinch. I didn't blow it up. I stopped holding it together with lies. Claire scoffed. That company is your life. It was Margaret replied. That's not the same thing. Claire stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. She turned to Daniel. And you, she said, you let her do this. Daniel met her gaze steadily. She made her own choices. Claire's laugh was sharp. You don't get to pretend you're not enjoying this. You finally get to be the hero. Daniel shook his head. There are no heroes here. Margaret stepped forward. Claire. I know you're scared. Don't, Claire snapped. Don't talk to me like I'm a child. Margaret nodded. Then I'll talk to you like an adult. I made decisions that protected my position and endangered other people. I won't do that anymore. Claire's shoulders sagged just a fraction. You could lose everything. I already did, Margaret said softly. I just didn't admit it. Silence filled the room. Heavy, unforgiving. Claire looked at Daniel again. If this goes bad, she said they'll come for you. He nodded. They already are. Another vibration. Daniel checked his phone. A voicemail notification. Unknown number. He played it on speaker. Daniel Carter, a man's voice said. Smooth. Cold. You've made some powerful people very uncomfortable. This is your opportunity to be reasonable. Call me back. Margaret's expression hardened. That's Halstead. Daniel deleted the message. He'll keep calling. And escalating. Claire added. Daniel met her gaze. Then we stay ahead. Outside sirens wailed faintly in the distance. News vans were probably lining up downtown. Talking heads rehearsing phrases like corporate accountability and systemic failure. Margaret looked from Daniel to her daughter. I didn't ask for this, she said. But I won't run from it. Claire swallowed. Neither will I. Daniel felt something settle. Not victory, alignment. This isn't about revenge, he said. It's about making sure the next override never happens. Margaret nodded. and making sure the people who tried to erase you understand they failed. Daniel glanced at the window at the street that no longer felt anonymous. They underestimated more than one thing he said. Another message flashed, this one from Tom. They shut down the line. Full stop. Safety review. Workers are cheering. Daniel closed his eyes, letting the weight of that sink in. Margaret read his face. What is it? They stopped production, he said. For safety. She let out a breath she'd been holding for years. Outside, the rain finally stopped. The sky began to clear, slow and deliberate, as if the city itself was catching up. Daniel looked at the two women standing in his living room. One had built an empire. The other had grown up in its shadow. This is bigger than us, he said quietly. Margaret met his gaze. It always was. And somewhere far from the quiet house on a residential street, the spine of a company was being tested to see if it would finally hold. The first injunction landed before noon. Daniel was standing at the sink, rinsing a coffee mug he hadn't finished, when Margaret's phone rang. She answered it without looking at the screen already braced. Yes, she said. I understand. No, I won't be retracting anything. She listened, her face tightening by degrees, then ended the call and set the phone down carefully like it might crack the counter if she dropped it. They're filing for an emergency injunction, she said, claiming the data release violates trade secret protections. Daniel nodded once. Expected. They're asking the court to freeze distribution and compel you to turn over all system credentials. Daniel dried his hands slowly. They can ask. Claire, who had been sitting rigidly on the edge of the couch, looked up. Can they get it? Margaret didn't answer right away. Daniel did. If they do, it won't be because they're right, he said. It'll be because they're fast. Another vibration. Daniel's phone this time. A message from Tom. Corporate just told us to preserve all records. No deletions. People are scared. But they're listening now. Daniel typed back a single line. Good. That means it's working. Margaret watched him. You're not backing down. No, he said. But I'm also not improvising. She tilted her head. You planned for this. I planned for resistance, Daniel replied. Not for courage. Claire let out a short, humorless laugh. You won't get much of that from the board. Not from the board, Daniel agreed. From the people underneath them. Another knock sounded at the door. Not agents this time, not lawyers, neighbors. A woman stood on the porch, mid-50s, hair pulled back, eyes uncertain. She held a phone in her hand like a shield. I'm sorry, she said, glancing past Daniel. I saw the news. The reporters are parking down the block. Daniel nodded. Thank you for telling me. She hesitated. Are you in trouble? Daniel met her eyes. I'm in the middle of something. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Be careful. When the door closed, the house felt smaller again, pressurized. Margaret checked her email, her jaw tightened. They're leaking counter-stories, she said. Anonymous sources, questioning your mental state, suggesting you left under performance review. Daniel's expression didn't change. They'll need more than whispers. They're also contacting former employees, Claire added, scrolling through her phone, looking for anyone willing to talk. Margaret's shoulders sagged just slightly. This is where people fold. Daniel shook his head. This is where systems show what they're made of. He walked to the laptop and opened a secure channel. Lines of text scrolled past. Names, locations, access points. What are you doing? Claire asked. Calling in the redundancy, Daniel replied. Margaret's eyes sharpened. You mean the people who... Yes, he said. The ones who kept copies. The ones who never trusted the board to do the right thing. He typed quickly. Fingers precise. Messages went out one by one. Claire watched. How many? Daniel paused. Enough. Margaret studied him. "You built this quietly." "I had to," he said. "If they'd known, they would have killed it." Another alert chimed. Daniel glanced at the screen and nodded. "They're responding." Margaret leaned in. "What does that mean?" "It means the mirror isn't just external anymore," he said. "It's distributed." Claire frowned. "Explain that like I'm not an engineer." Daniel smiled faintly. "It means they can't erase this by shutting me up." A car door slammed outside, then another. Voices raised. Margaret moved to the window. "They're here." Daniel followed her gaze. 2 black SUVs idled at the curb. Men in suits stepped out, phones already in hand. "Private security," Margaret said. "Board hired." "They can't come in," Claire said. "They don't need to," Daniel replied. "They just need to intimidate." His phone rang again. Halstead's number. This time, Daniel answered. "Mr. Carter," Halstead said smoothly. "This is escalating unnecessarily." Daniel leaned against the counter. "You escalated it when you tried to erase people." A pause. "You're making a mistake," Halstead said. "There are ways to resolve this quietly." Daniel glanced at Margaret, at Claire, at the house that no longer felt like a refuge. "Quietly is how people get hurt," he replied. "You're exposing yourself to criminal liability," Halstead warned. Daniel's voice stayed level. "Then charge me." Another pause. Longer. "You don't understand the forces you're challenging," Halstead said. Daniel smiled. "I designed them." He ended the call. Outside, one of the men in suits raised a camera toward the house. Claire stiffened. "They're filming." "Let them," Margaret said. "They want optics. We give them truth." Her phone rang again. She glanced at it and closed her eyes briefly. The judge denied the injunction, she said. Daniel looked up sharply. "Denied, deferred," Margaret corrected. "Pending review." "That buys us time." Claire let out a breath. "How much?" "Enough," Margaret said. "If we don't waste it." Daniel nodded. "Then we don't." He opened another window on the laptop. A schedule. A list of contacts. By tonight, he said, every plant supervisor will have access to the same records the regulators do. Margaret's eyebrows rose. "That will cause chaos." "Yes," Daniel replied. "And accountability." Claire crossed her arms. "And if the board retaliates?" "They will," Margaret said. "Publicly." Daniel met her gaze. "Then we meet them there." The doorbell rang again, this time sharp, insistent. Daniel checked the camera feed. A reporter stood on the porch, microphone in hand, producer hovering behind her. Margaret straightened. "They're ready." Claire looked between them. "Are you?" Daniel felt the weight settle fully now. "Not fear, purpose. I spent decades making sure systems worked when people didn't," he said. "This is just another test." He opened the door. The reporter smiled, practiced and hungry. "Mr. Carter," she said, "do you have a comment on allegations that you sabotaged Apex Manufacturing out of personal grievance?" Daniel looked straight into the camera. "I didn't sabotage anything," he said. "I documented it." Behind him, Margaret stepped into frame. Calm, unflinching. "And I authorized it," she said, "because no company is worth protecting if it requires people to get hurt." The reporter blinked, recalibrating. Cameras clicked. The moment stretched. Claire watched from inside, heart pounding, realizing something irreversible had just happened. The narrative had shifted, not because of spin, because of alignment. Daniel closed the door after the reporter left. The house fell quiet again, but it was a different quiet now. Charged, intentional. Margaret exhaled slowly. "There's no going back." Daniel nodded. "There never was." Outside, the SUVs pulled away, replaced by news vans. Across the city, phones rang. Meetings convened. People who had been silent for years began to speak. Daniel looked at Margaret. "They tried to make me small." She met his gaze. They failed. And somewhere deep inside the machinery of a company built on compromise, something essential was breaking loose. The backlash didn't arrive all at once. It crept in sideways, disguised as concern wrapped in language that sounded reasonable until you listened closely. By mid-afternoon, Daniel's name was trending. Not nationally, not yet, regionally. The kind of attention that starts small and metastasizes if left unchecked. He sat at the table again, laptop open, watching the narrative fracture in real time. One outlet framed him as a whistleblower. Another called him a disgruntled former employee. A third hedged using words like complicated and nuanced, the way institutions did when they weren't ready to commit to the truth. Margaret stood behind him, reading over his shoulder. "They're floating trial balloons," she said, "seeing which version sticks." Claire paced near the window phone, pressed to her ear, speaking in clipped, careful sentences. When she hung up, her face was tight. "They're calling former supervisors," she said, "offering legal protection in exchange for statements." Daniel didn't look up. "Anyone bite?" "Not yet," Claire replied. "But they will." Margaret nodded. Fear is persuasive. Daniel finally closed the laptop. Then we stopped letting them be alone with it. He stood and walked to the whiteboard mounted near the hallway, a relic from a half-finished home project. He picked up a marker and began writing names. Plant managers, safety leads, engineers who had been there long enough to remember why the rules existed. Claire watched, brow furrowed. "You're building a coalition." "I'm reminding people they're not isolated," Daniel said. "They think this is about me." "It's not." Margaret crossed her arms. "The board will respond by tightening control." "They already are," Daniel replied. "That's why this has to move faster than their lawyers." His phone buzzed. A secure message channel lit up. "Tom Alvarez. They just pulled our regional director into a closed-door meeting. HR is nervous. People are whispering." Daniel typed back. "Tell them to keep records. Everything. No verbal agreements." Tom replied almost instantly. "Already done." Margaret studied Daniel. "You're coordinating an internal resistance." He met her gaze. "I'm coordinating memory." Outside, the street was no longer quiet. A satellite truck idled at the corner. A cameraman adjusted his lens. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, trying to decide if this was something dangerous or historic. Another message came in. This one from a number Daniel recognized but hadn't heard from in years. "Evelyn Grant." He hesitated, then answered. "Daniel," Evelyn said. Her voice was steady, older, seasoned. "I saw the footage." Evelyn had been head of compliance before retiring. Sharp. Principled. Pushed out quietly after asking the wrong questions. "I figured you would," Daniel replied. "They're lying," she said. "No preamble. And they're scared." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "Are you willing to say that publicly?" A pause. He could hear her breathing. "Yes," she said, "but not alone." Daniel felt something shift. "I won't ask you to." "You didn't," Evelyn replied. "You just finally gave me a reason." Margaret's eyes widened slightly when Daniel ended the call. "Evelyn." "Yes." Margaret exhaled. "That changes things." Claire stopped pacing. "Who's Evelyn?" "Someone they couldn't break," Margaret said. Only silence. Daniel returned to the table and reopened the laptop. He began drafting an outline, not for press, not for regulators, but for people inside the company who still believed the work mattered. Claire leaned over. "You're writing a letter." "A statement," Daniel corrected. "Not from me. From us." Margaret nodded slowly. Collective voice, collective responsibility, he replied. The phone rang again. Unknown number. Daniel answered. Daniel Carter, a man's voice said, clipped and careful. This is Senator Raymond's office. He's requesting a meeting. Margaret stiffened. That's fast. Daniel didn't respond immediately. On what basis workplace safety concerns in his district, the voice said, and potential federal implications. Daniel glanced at Margaret, at Claire, at the whiteboard full of names. Tell him I'll call back, Daniel said, after I finish something. He ended the call. Claire stared at him. That's a United States Senator. Daniel nodded, which means the ground is shifting. Margaret watched him closely. You're not impressed. I'm cautious, he replied. Power only shows up when it thinks it can shape the outcome. Outside, a car horn blared. Someone shouted. The neighborhood was losing its insulation. Margaret's phone buzzed again. She checked it and let out a slow breath. The board released a statement. Daniel looked up. Let me guess. They express concern. They reaffirm commitment to safety. They announce an independent review. Yes, she said. And they place the blame on legacy systems. Daniel smiled without warmth. Legacy systems don't send emails. Claire's phone chimed. They're blaming you again, she said, saying you resisted modernization. Daniel nodded. That's their best angle. Margaret's jaw tightened. They're rewriting history. They always do, Daniel replied, until too many people remember it differently. A knock came at the door. Not a reporter this time, not security. Daniel checked the camera feed. A man stood on the porch, older hands clasped, posture uncertain. He opened the door. The man introduced himself quietly. I worked at the Dayton plant, he said. Retired last year. Daniel stepped aside. Come in. The man removed his cap, holding it in both hands. I saw what you did, he said. I didn't think anyone would. Margaret watched from the kitchen, eyes softening. I lost a friend on that floor, the man continued. Machine override. They said it was an accident. Daniel nodded once. He knew the case. I don't want anything the man said. I just wanted you to know you're not wrong. He left as quietly as he came. Claire swallowed hard. They're coming, she said. Not just the media, the people. Margaret looked at Daniel. This is where it gets dangerous. For who Daniel asked. For everyone she replied. He met her gaze steady. Then we keep going. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the living room. The day felt compressed heavy with consequence. Daniel's phone buzzed again. A group message now, names filling the screen. Plant supervisors, engineers, compliance officers. We're in. Daniel closed his eyes, letting the weight of that settle. Margaret stepped closer. Once this becomes collective, she said they can't contain it. Daniel nodded. That's the point. Claire looked between them. What happens when they try to make examples? Daniel looked at her. Then they'll have to make a lot of them. Outside, the first evening lights flickered on. The story was no longer contained within a house on a quiet street. It was moving outward, carried by voices that had waited too long to be heard. Daniel returned to the laptop and hit send. The statement went live. And across a company built on quiet compromises, something old and brittle began to crack, not from force, but from memory, refusing to stay buried. The first resignation hit the board before sunset. Daniel saw it not through an announcement, but through silence. A familiar name vanished from the internal directory, the way people disappeared when they wanted to be forgotten. He didn't smile. This wasn't a victory. It was the beginning of instability. Margaret stood near the window again, phone in hand, listening without interrupting. When the call ended, she lowered the phone slowly. Lowell, she said. Effective immediately. Daniel nodded once. He knew where this was going. He knew he couldn't survive discovery, Margaret replied. None of them can if it stays collective. Claire leaned against the wall, arms crossed, absorbing the weight of the day. He'll claim health reasons, she said. They always do, Margaret said. It's the last shield. Daniel refreshed the screen. Another alert appeared, then another. A regional director placed on administrative leave. A compliance officer requesting immunity. An internal memo quietly retracting language from the board's morning statement. They're retreating, Claire said. They're reorganizing, Daniel corrected. Retreat implies acceptance. This is positioning. His phone buzzed. This time the name was unfamiliar, but the number wasn't blocked. Daniel Carter, a woman's voice said. Calm, measured. This is Deputy Secretary Helen Ross, Department of Labor. I'm calling regarding your documentation. Margaret went still. I'm listening, Daniel replied. We've reviewed the preliminary materials, Ross continued. What you provided suggests systemic failure, not isolated misconduct. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. That's correct. There are individuals inside Apex who want to cooperate, Ross said. They're afraid. They believe you can protect them. Daniel glanced at Margaret. Protection isn't something I control. No, Ross said. But credibility is. And right now you have it. The line went quiet for a moment. We're convening a joint task force, Ross continued. Federal and state. There will be subpoenas, public hearings. Daniel exhaled slowly. Then this is no longer internal. It never was, Ross replied. It was just treated that way. The call ended. Claire let out a breath she'd been holding. That sounded serious. Margaret nodded. That sounded irreversible. Outside, the news vans multiplied. Lights flickered on as evening settled in. The house glowed like a nerve center, not a refuge. Daniel sat back down and rubbed his eyes. Fatigue crept in now, heavy and insistent. Adrenaline could only carry him so far. Margaret noticed. You need to rest. I can't, he said. You must, she replied. If you collapse, they'll use it. He looked at her. I'm not collapsing. She softened slightly. You don't have to prove that to me. Claire watched them, seeing something shift between them that had nothing to do with power or strategy. Two people who had finally stopped pretending they were invulnerable. A sharp knock cut through the room. Daniel checked the feed. A woman stood on the porch, older posture, straight eyes steady. No microphone, no camera crew. He opened the door. She introduced herself quietly. My name is Ruth Coleman. I worked quality assurance at Apex for 22 years. Daniel stepped aside. Come in. Ruth sat carefully, hands folded in her lap. I didn't want to go to the press, she said. I didn't trust them. Margaret sat across from her. Then why are you here? Ruth met her gaze. Because I watched 3 reports get buried. And because when I tried to escalate, I was told to retire early. Claire's breath caught. I signed an agreement. Ruth continued. Non-disclosure. They said I'd lose my pension if I spoke. Daniel leaned forward. Did you keep copies? Ruth nodded. I kept everything. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, not in relief, in recognition. You were never meant to be alone, she said. Ruth's voice shook just slightly. I thought I was. Daniel took the folder she offered and set it gently on the table. You're not. Another resignation notification chimed. Claire looked at the screen. That's 3. Margaret stood. They're trying to outrun the wave. They won't, Daniel said. Too many people have decided to stand. Ruth watched him closely. You're not doing this for attention. No, Daniel replied. I'm doing it because silence costs more. The evening deepened. Calls came in waves. Former engineers. Safety inspectors. A plant nurse who documented injuries that never made it into reports. Each voice added weight. Each story sharpened the outline of what had been hidden. Margaret moved through it all with quiet authority, guiding conversations, grounding emotions, reminding people they were heard. This was the leadership she'd buried under years of caution. At one point, Claire pulled her aside. "You're different," she said. Margaret met her daughter's eyes. "I'm honest." Claire swallowed. "I didn't think you could be." Margaret reached out, resting her hand briefly on Claire's arm. "Neither did I." Daniel watched them from across the room, something warm and unfamiliar stirring beneath the exhaustion. This wasn't just about systems breaking, it was about people reconnecting to themselves. Another call came in, this one from Halstead's number. Daniel let it ring. And ring. Finally he answered. "You're enjoying this," Halstead said, voice tight. Daniel leaned back. "No," he said. "I'm enduring it." "You've crossed a line," Halstead snapped. "You've triggered exposure that will damage livelihoods." Daniel's voice stayed level. "They damaged those livelihoods when they chose profit over safety. You think regulators will protect you?" Halstead pressed. "They'll turn on you the moment it's convenient." "Then I'll still have told the truth," Daniel replied. A beat of silence. "You don't know how this ends," Halstead said quietly. Daniel smiled just enough. "Neither do you." He ended the call. Margaret looked at him. "They're scared now." "They should be," he replied. "They built their power on silence." Outside, a cheer rose from somewhere down the block. A small group had gathered. Workers, maybe. Neighbors. People who recognized a fight when they saw one. Daniel stood and looked out the window. Faces turned upward, lit by streetlights and phone screens. Not angry. Hopeful. "This isn't contained anymore," Claire said softly. Daniel nodded. "It's not supposed to be." Margaret joined him at the window. "Whatever comes next," she said, "it will be bigger than us." He met her gaze. That's how change works. The night stretched on heavy but purposeful. Inside the house, documents stacked, voices overlapped, and something long suppressed moved toward daylight. For the first time since the knock on the door, Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief. Resolve. The story was no longer about a man who quit his job. It was about a system that could no longer hide. And somewhere deep in the machinery of a powerful institution, the consequences were already turning. The hearing was scheduled for the following morning, and by midnight the house no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like a staging ground. Daniel sat alone at the table now, the others finally resting in fragments of sleep scattered across the house. Papers were stacked neatly to his left. A legal pad lay open in front of him, still mostly blank. He hadn't written a single note. He didn't need them. Outside, the street was quiet again. The news vans gone, the crowd dispersed. Quiet after noise always felt louder. It pressed in. His phone buzzed. A message from an unfamiliar number, no name attached. "We can make this stop. Walk away tomorrow. No testimony. No consequences." Daniel stared at the screen, then set the phone face down without replying. He'd been receiving variations of the same message all evening. Different numbers, same promise, same threat, hidden underneath. Footsteps sounded softly behind him. Margaret didn't speak at first. She came to the table and set a mug of coffee down beside him. Steam rose in the low light. "You're still awake," she said. "So are you?" Daniel replied. She sat across from him, folding her hands together. Her face looked older tonight. Not weakened, stripped of armor. "They'll try to discredit you in the morning," she said. "Character, motivation, mental state. They already have," Daniel said. They'll try to frame this as personal, she continued. A grievance. A failed career. Daniel looked at her. Do you believe that Margaret shook her head? No. Then neither will the truth, he said. She studied him, searching for something. You don't sound angry. I was, Daniel replied. A long time ago. Tonight I'm clear. She nodded slowly. Clarity scares people. A pause settled between them. Not awkward. Heavy with everything they hadn't said. I should have listened to you sooner, Margaret said quietly. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He stared at the blank page in front of him. You listened when it mattered, he said finally. Her mouth tightened. People got hurt. Yes, he agreed. And pretending otherwise wouldn't heal them. Another silence. Deeper now. After tomorrow, Margaret said, there's no version of my life that goes back to how it was. Daniel met her gaze. That was true before you knocked on my door. She almost smiled. A door creaked softly down the hall. Claire appeared, hair pulled back, face pale, but determined. I couldn't sleep, she said. They're already speculating about the hearing. Online. Daniel nodded. They will. Claire hesitated, then stepped closer. I read everything tonight. The reports, the emails, the timelines. Margaret's breath caught, and Claire swallowed. You were right. The words landed carefully, like something fragile being placed back where it belonged. I didn't want to believe it, Claire continued. I wanted it to be exaggerated or misinterpreted. Margaret reached for her hand. Claire let her. I'm sorry, Claire said, for thinking you chose the company over people. Margaret's eyes shone, but she didn't look away. I did, she said. And I won't again. Daniel watched them, something settling quietly inside him. This wasn't vindication. It was repair. Claire turned to him. They're going to come after you hardest, she said. You know that. Yes, Daniel replied. Are you afraid? He considered the question honestly. No, he said. I was afraid of staying silent. Claire nodded once. Then I'll be there. Morning came faster than expected. The hearing room was colder than Daniel anticipated. Bright lights, long tables, microphones arranged like traps. People filled the seats behind them, faces intent, notebooks ready. Margaret sat beside him, posture straight, expression composed. Claire sat just behind them, hands folded tightly in her lap. Across the room, the board's legal team whispered urgently among themselves. Halstead sat rigid, jaw-clenched, eyes fixed anywhere but Daniel. The chairwoman called the hearing to order. Mr. Carter, she said, voice formal. You've been asked here to testify regarding your role in the release of internal Apex manufacturing documents. Daniel leaned toward the microphone. His voice carried easily. Calm. Measured. I'm here because people were injured, he said, and because the systems designed to prevent that were overridden. Murmurs rippled through the room. The chairwoman raised a hand. You're aware you're under oath. Yes, Daniel replied. That's why I'm here. A board attorney stood. Isn't it true you designed those systems? Yes. And isn't it true you maintained access after your resignation? Daniel didn't hesitate. Access was never the issue. Accountability was. The attorney frowned. Please answer the question. I did, Daniel said evenly. Margaret watched the room shift. Subtle, almost imperceptible. The rhythm was changing. Another attorney stepped forward. You claim safety concerns justified your actions, yet internal reviews show no violations during your tenure. Daniel nodded. That's because the reviews were edited. Gasps, shifting chairs. Edited how the attorney demanded. Daniel reached into his folder and slid a document forward. Like this. The chairwoman leaned in. Staffers moved quickly. Screens lit up. Emails appeared, redactions, timestamps, instructions written in language designed to sound procedural. Silence fell. Margaret felt it then, the moment when denial collapsed under its own weight. Halstead stood abruptly. "This is a misrepresentation." "Sit down," the chairwoman snapped. Daniel continued, his voice steady. "I warned my superiors repeatedly. I documented risks. I escalated concerns." He paused, letting the words breathe. "I was told to make it work." Margaret's hands tightened together. "People think systems fail because of incompetence," Daniel said. "They don't. They fail because someone decides the risk is acceptable." The chairwoman leaned back. "And who made that decision?" Daniel didn't look at Halstead. He didn't need to. "The board," he said, "or those acting with its knowledge." The room erupted. Margaret felt Claire's hand grip her arm. Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't wipe them away. This was not collapse. This was exposure. The hearing recessed amid chaos. Reporters surged. Voices overlapped. Questions flew like sparks. Daniel stood suddenly exhausted. Margaret touched his arm. "You did it," she said. He shook his head. "We did." Outside, cameras flashed. Microphones thrust forward. "Mr. Carter," someone shouted, "do you regret releasing the documents?" Daniel looked into the cameras, into the faces beyond them. "No," he said. "I regret waiting." Margaret stepped forward beside him. "So do I." They didn't say anything else. They didn't need to. Because the story had shifted again. Not toward resolution, toward reckoning. And somewhere beyond the bright lights and the shouting voices, people who had been invisible for years were finally being seen. The fallout didn't arrive as an explosion. It came as a slow grinding shift, the kind that changed everything without announcing itself. Daniel stood at the edge of the courthouse steps as the crowd thinned, the noise fading into fragments of conversation and distant sirens. His body felt hollowed out, not from fear or regret, but from release. The truth once spoken took something with it when it left. Margaret stood beside him, shoulders squared, face composed in a way cameras could never fully capture. She wasn't performing. She was steadying herself for what came next. By evening, the headlines hardened. Not speculation anymore. Confirmation. Board members suspended. Federal oversight initiated. Plants ordered to halt operations pending independent safety audits. Apex Manufacturing, once praised for efficiency and growth, was now a case study in how silence became policy. Daniel returned home alone that night. The house was quiet again. Finally quiet in a way that didn't feel temporary. He set his keys on the table and sat down, letting the stillness settle into his bones. For the first time in years, there was nothing waiting for him to fix. His phone buzzed once. A message from Tom. They shut down the Dayton line permanently. No layoffs. Retraining instead. People are relieved. Some are crying. Daniel closed his eyes and leaned back in the chair. He didn't smile. He breathed. Over the next few days, the calls kept coming, but they changed in tone. Fewer threats, more questions. People who had once stayed quiet now wanted guidance. Engineers, supervisors, compliance officers from other companies asking how it had gone wrong and how it could be prevented again. Daniel answered only what mattered. He declined interviews, declined panels, declined offers that tried to turn him into something symbolic instead of human. Margaret handled the rest. She testified again this time, not in defense but in accounting. She didn't posture. She didn't soften the truth. She spoke about incentives, about pressure, about how easy it was to justify one small override until it became a system. Her words carried weight because they were unadorned. Claire watched from the gallery. something like pride replacing the resentment she had carried for years. Afterward, she hugged her mother without apology or explanation. Neither of them needed it anymore. Weeks passed. The board was restructured. New leadership appointed under federal oversight. Policies rewritten not as slogans, but as enforceable standards. Apex survived smaller and slower but safer. That mattered more. Daniel was offered a role officially this time: Senior Operations and Culture Advisor. Limited hours, clear boundaries, no emergency calls after dark, no authority without accountability. He accepted on one condition: that every safety decision would be logged, that every override would require independent review, that no one person could be blamed for what a system allowed. They agreed. The first day he returned to a plant floor, people didn't clap. They nodded. Quiet recognition. That was enough. Margaret stepped back from executive life entirely. She remained a shareholder and advisor when asked, but no longer the center of gravity. She began showing up at places she'd ignored for years. Community meetings, worker forums, dinners she didn't cancel. Sometimes she and Daniel sat together in silence, coffee cooling between them, neither of them needing to fill the space. What they shared was not romance or rescue. It was recognition. Two people who had finally stopped pretending their value came from endurance. On a late afternoon, months after the knock that started everything, Daniel stood in his kitchen watching the lights stretch across the floor. The house felt lived in now, not finished, honest. He thought about how easily this could have gone differently, how close he'd come to walking away and letting the story write itself without him. How many people had done exactly that, believing silence was safer? Margaret arrived quietly, letting herself in without ceremony. She set a small paper bag on the counter. "Dinner," she said. "Nothing fancy." Daniel smiled faintly. "Good." They ate without urgency, talking about small things. Weather. A book Claire had recommended. A plant supervisor who'd finally taken a vacation. Later, as the evening settled in, Daniel stood at the window again. The street was quiet, ordinary. No cameras, no crowds. "This wasn't about winning," he said. Margaret joined him. "No," she agreed. "It was about stopping the loss." He nodded. "People think power looks like control. And it rarely does," she said. "It looks like restraint." Daniel turned toward her. "You could have protected yourself." She met his gaze. "So could you." They stood there, not triumphant, not healed, but aligned. That mattered more than any outcome. Because the truth did not fix everything. It never did. But it shifted the weight. It redistributed the cost. It made silence expensive again. And sometimes that was enough to change the direction of things. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to like and subscribe and share your voice by commenting these 3 words. Tell your story.